your last book, Sala's Gift, as Gabe mentioned, was about your mother's story during the Holocaust, a completely different book from Lady of the OK Corral. What inspired you to write this book? Were you planning to write on a completely different topic, or did Josephine come to you?
Josephine came to me in a dream. No, not really. But after I finished Sala's Gift, I realized that I liked this writing thing. I loved doing the research and then putting the book together. And so I was casting about for another subject. And then, as I just read to you, somebody called me up, and actually it was an email, and said, had I heard about Wyatt Earp's Jewish wife? And in part, what seemed like tremendous fun to me was after a decade of having my head in the Holocaust, that I would have the opportunity to research a whole other area of history that wasn't nearly as dark. And I thought, well, now I'm totally in a new place. I'm out of the Holocaust, and I'm out of Europe. But no, there's actually some links. If you look at it very broadly, I guess what fascinates me is the story of really interesting, strong women who get swept up in historical events and then have to reinvent themselves. And so there's that link, although there's really nothing in common between my mother and Josephine. I want to make that absolutely clear. But there was that thematic link for me, and then lo and behold, I discovered that the part of Europe that Josephine was from is actually quite close to where my mother is from.
Which I was actually going to ask you. So Josephine's family, parents, came from Posen, which is a Polish province of Prussia. And can you tell us more about Posen and also Josephine's heritage? Because as we know from your book, she always wanted to be identified as a German Jew and not Polish.
She insisted she was German. And before I did the work on this, I sort of thought that German-Polish prejudice was a relatively recent thing and was only in New York. Not true. The roots of it really go quite deep. And if you go back to the 19th century, the Jews from that eastern part of the Prussian Empire, the Posen province, tended to be less well-educated, more religious. They spoke Yiddish rather than German. And so the German Jews looked down on them because they were better educated and richer and more secular. And those prejudices totally got translated into the United States. They got translated into the New York Jewish community, and then lo and behold, they got translated into the San Francisco Jewish community. So it was a prejudice that sort of went along for the ride as Jews immigrated to the United States. Josephine didn't want to be second class anything. And so the idea that she was living in this highly stratified society in San Francisco, where the German Jews went to different schools, went to different synagogues, went to different parties. Josephine didn't like that at all. And I think it's part of the reason that she ran away from home. And it is definitely part of the reason why, for the rest of her life, if anybody asked her about her parents, she would say they were German Jews. She would say her father was a rich German merchant, which is totally untrue.
Because Josephine was all about perception.
Yes.
Just as you mentioned, so Josephine's parents immigrated to America. They briefly settled in New York, and then they moved out west to San Francisco, showing that same adventurous side that would come out of their daughter and cause her to run away and pursue a stage career. As you were just speaking of, can you expand more on what you were talking about, of what life was like for Jewish immigrants who were drawn to the West?
The Marcus family was a poor family. I think that Josephine's father was a baker, and he and Sophia, Josephine's mother, met in New York. They came from Prussia, from Posen, around 1850. Josephine was born in 1860. They spent the Civil War in New York. But they weren't thriving at all. And in the Jewish newspapers of the time, you would read constantly the letters that people would send back from the West to the Jewish newspapers in New York saying, wow, the streets are paved with gold here in San Francisco, it's so fantastic. And so a lot of families did what the Marcuses did, which was take a second hop out to California. It was a long trip. They went via the Isthmus of Panama and then by steamer boat up from all the way up the western coast of California. But then when they got there, they found really a thriving Jewish community, and there was much more opportunity than there had been for them. One of the things about the San Francisco Jewish community that really stuck in my mind, which will give you a sense of how influential the Jewish community in San Francisco was, is that the steamer service, which is really what connected San Francisco to the rest of the United States, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there were no steamers. I think that's pretty interesting, right? I mean, it's as if the subway stopped running, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Maybe we should promote that idea.
It's very interesting that her parents were very much in a part of the Jewish community. But when Josephine and Wyatt were constantly moving from place to place, they were in towns such as Tombstone, San Diego, and Nome that had thriving Jewish communities, but Josephine never chose to take part of that. Why?
I quoted Nora Ephron in the book because Nora Ephron was the person who said that, yeah, I'm Jewish, but it's not one of the first 5 things I'd want you to know about me. And I think that was true of Josephine as well. She never hid that she was Jewish, but she also never embraced it in any way until that final crisis in her life when Wyatt died. And then suddenly she decides to bury him in the family plot in San Francisco. Tombstone, as you said, had a thriving Jewish community. There was something called the Tombstone Hebrew Benevolent Association. There were Jews who served on the jury that acquitted Wyatt Earp after the gunfight at the OK Corral. And even in places as remote as Nome, Alaska, where the Earps spent a couple of summers. There were Jewish New Year services in Nome, Alaska in the summer of 1900. It was a front page story in the Nome Daily News. Today they call them the Frozen Chosen. It's kind of funny. But Josephine never, as opposed to her sister, none of her family remained Jewish affiliated except for one sister. And now, these generations later, there's only one part of the family that is still Jewish. The rest of the family is not. And so, for her, I think it was just kind of like, yeah, I'm Jewish, so what? And she took no comfort in it.
I am a singer, as Gabe said, so when I read this book, I was so excited when I found out that Josephine and I have something in common, besides Wyatt, that both of our first professional operas was HMS Pinafore, and you'll know from the book that she toured with HMS Pinafore Troupe. So tell us about Josephine's pursuit of her stage career and how that led her to Tombstone.
She always loved the theater, so there was a tremendous amount of theater in San Francisco when she was growing up, and it was her great delight for her older sister to take her to the theater. It was what she loved more than anything else. The HMS Pinafore craze in the United States around 1870 or so is just not to be believed. I mean, Justin Bieber, forget it. This was the most outrageous thing. It just swept through the country, and every town had a Pinafore troupe. And Josephine, she wasn't much of a singer. She was actually a little bit more of a dancer than a singer. But they were so eager for actors to join the troupes because every town needed to have a Pinafore performance. So they came to the amateur dancing academy that Josephine attended with her sister, and they recruited high school age students, and so off Josephine went to the Arizona Territory, ran away from home, and found herself in the Arizona Territory, which really was a turning point in her life.
Absolutely. that would lead her to meeting Wyatt. They fell in love, and that, very little known fact, led to the gunfight at OK Corral. I would love for you to tell us more about how she precipitated that gunfight.
Well, the gunfight. When Josephine first ran away from home to become an actress and a dancer, she met a dapper lawman named, no, not Wyatt Earp, Johnny Bean. And Johnny Bean was kind of a slick fellow and much older than Josephine. And he said, come to Tombstone and be my wife. And Josephine said, okay. So off she went to Tombstone, and she lived there with Johnny Bean and his 9-year-old son for close to a year. And she was known as Mrs. Bean. You know, we have postal money orders that she signed as Mrs. Bean. But she wasn't Mrs. Bean because Johnny Bean had no intention ever of marrying Josephine. He thought it was pretty cool to have this exotic, curvy woman living with him and taking care of his son, but marry her? No. When Josephine figured that out, she threw Johnny out, and soon after that met Wyatt. Well, I don't know how many of you feel like you know everything there is to know about the gunfight at the OK Corral. It actually didn't even happen at the OK Corral. It happened in an alley next to the OK Corral. So, you know, so if anybody talks to you about the OK Corral, tell them that, and they'll know you're a real insider. You know. But the OK Corral had Wyatt and his brothers and Doc Holliday against a group of cowboys and rustlers who were actually friends of and allied with Johnny Bean. So the gunfight had you know, deep roots in politics. One side, Wyatt and his brothers were Republicans, Johnny Bean and the cowboys were Democrats. Wyatt Earp and his brothers represented the townspeople interest and the mining interest in Tombstone, whereas the cowboys and the rustlers represented the ranches. So this, and one side fought for the North in the Civil War, and one side fought for the South in the Civil War. All of that is behind the gunfight at the OK Corral. But when you cut right through it, Josephine had a lover on both sides, right? So Johnny Bean is affiliated on one side, Wyatt on the other. Because after she left Johnny Bean, you know, even though he didn't necessarily want her anymore, didn't mean that he wanted anybody else to have her. So all of that went into the famous, and it's the most famous gunfight in American history, sort of a dubious distinction when you think about it, but there we go.
And unfortunately, she is left out of that.
Totally
left out of that. You know, I would like to know, you know, she really, status and perception was very important to her, but she was also very much a woman of contradiction. You know, she always claimed that she and Wyatt were legally married, and they weren't. She was always very fearful that the truth about Mattie Earp's tragic death would come out. And for those of you who don't know, another love triangle, Wyatt left his common law wife, Mattie Earp, for Josephine, and Josephine ended up being Mattie ended up being destitute and eventually committing suicide. So Josephine was always afraid that would come out.
She had two deep dark secrets,
Yeah.
Mrs. Bean and the other Mrs. Earp.
And so but when Wyatt and she were having his biography written, which she had a very strong hand in, she basically wrote herself out of history. Why was she so insistent on that?
The America that Wyatt Earp and Josephine lived in from 1881 until about, let's say, 1905, 1910, that was an America of the boom towns. And Wyatt made his living as a gambler, as a saloon keeper, a little bit of prostitution on the side. All of those things were legal and quite common in the boom towns and in the early territories. But the pendulum swung to the other side, swung to the other side, swung to the other side. I'm supposed to know something about English, right? Sorry. The pendulum swung, and America became, quite puritanical, and so gambling was illegal, and in comes prohibition. And here, Wyatt Earp, the saloon keeper, you can't get a drink anymore. And so Josephine became increasingly sensitive to the scandal that might erupt if anybody knew that she had been in a common law relationship in Tombstone, or that Wyatt had had this wife in Tombstone. And so she wanted to protect herself, and she also just hated the image of Wyatt as gunslinger. She wanted everybody to think of him as a lawman, a peace officer. And so she very carefully crafted his biography to make sure that you could sing the song, Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold, but wouldn't necessarily think of him as the guy who went on the vendetta ride after the gunfight at the OK Corral and pretty much killed everybody he thought had anything to do with the harm that came to his brothers after the gunfight. So she was, she was a very modern public relations kind of person. If a story was coming out in the newspaper that she didn't like, she did everything she could to stop it. And if she couldn't stop it and it appeared, then she would rally all of Wyatt's famous friends, whether it was Bat Masterson or Tom Mix or William S. Hart, to write things in the newspaper that Wyatt really was a great guy. And if all else failed, she would demand a retraction, and sometimes she would actually get it. So she had this very modern sense, not only of public relations, but of celebrity. I think she was really quite ahead of her time that way.
I agree. You just prompted me to think that when they were writing this, she is so fiercely protective of Wyatt. In your research, did you ever come across anything where love was ever talked about between the two of them? He was a quiet man, didn't speak a lot, and I know when I was reading, but is there any correspondence between the two of them? I mean, they were together all the time, but where she talks about her emotional feelings for Wyatt?
Oh, this was truly a love story. It was. Wyatt was an incredibly handsome man. And yes. And Josephine was a pretty sexy babe in her younger days. She started to look like sort of the older Sophie Tucker in her later days. But she was quite a babe for a long time. And I think that the letters that I think of in response to your question are really the letters she wrote after he died. She was bereft after he died. She didn't go to his funeral. I think because she was just too broken up. And the letters she writes to their mutual friend John Flood, who drafted the first version of Wyatt's biography, are incredibly poignant. I mean, they've been together for nearly 50 years in some pretty intense circumstances, and lived every summer, every winter out in the California desert, just the two of them sleeping under the stars. This was totally a deep romance. And so those letters she writes after he dies, in which she kind of doesn't know what to do with herself, because they've been such a couple with a division of labor, and now all of a sudden she has to make decisions on her own. I find it very poignant.
But she did not have a great relationship with his family. So after he died, I think she had this reputation of not being a very approachable woman, and his side of the family did not embrace her. And so she, of course, if you read as you read in the book, she goes back to her roots. Can you talk more about why the Earps did not embrace her? I know they did embrace Maddie, because she lived with his family even after Wyatt left her, but why didn't that cohesion never happen with the Earps?
Some of it had to do with Josephine being sort of a difficult person, but I think more of it had to do with the fact that Wyatt became disproportionately important in history. Virgil was actually, much more of a reputable lawman than Wyatt was. But because it's Wyatt who walks out of the gunfight, and Virgil later gets maimed when the cowboys come after him in revenge, it's really Wyatt that's stuck in people's minds. And so I think the rest of the Earp family resented that. The more famous he became, the more he overshadowed Virgil and the other brothers. So I think a lot of it was resentment for that. The rest of it had to do, I think, with the fact that Josephine could be quite difficult. Even writing about her, I had sort of a love-hate relationship. There were times when I thought, oh, Josephine, that is so mean. She could be very mean. But then she was also totally delightful, and so I could see both sides of her.
I think it's incredible that we're really just having Josephine come to the spotlight through your book. I mean, I think how does she get so lost in history?
It's the untold story of women. It's not unique to Josephine. A sense that women's stories don't need to be told, that somehow they're not important. In Josephine's case, she was afraid to have her story told, so she was very active in doing that. But I have to say, even when my mother gave me 350 letters that she had saved in Nazi slave labor camps, and I said, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen, and I felt like I'd been struck with lightning, and I felt that we had something incredibly important to give to history. My mother thought and said, well, it's not so important, it's just my letters. My story isn't important, everybody's got a story. And I think it was not until the day that we actually went to the New York Public Library to show them the letters that my mother realized that her story is incredibly important. So I think there's a modesty that's almost, and a humility that really goes way too far to say, I'm not important, I'm just sort of a bystander. And imagine, in Josephine's case, imagine trying to write a biography of, Ronald Reagan without talking about Nancy, or Lincoln, without Mrs. Lincoln. So the woman behind the man story is really incredibly interesting. And yet for a century or more, Josephine has been totally left out of those histories at all. And the women of the West were left out of the history. So it's as if there really were no women there at all. And that's part of what made me feel that this is a story with such deep American roots. And you can't tell the story of America without telling the story of the West. And how can you tell any of those stories without putting the women back in the picture? So for me, Josephine became an incredibly important lens into American history.
And I think it's very apropos that you, a woman, brought her back into history.
Well, thank you.
Gabe, how are we doing on time? We were talking about Josephine. Even though Josephine was all about status, she sure didn't have any problems when she loved to gamble.
A little too much.
She probably had a problem. Wyatt didn't, he loved, she had a problem. Also the horse racing, when they were in San Diego, it was really like she had kind